In early 2025, the lead time for a custom-built utility-scale power transformer in North America reached an average of 36 months. To put that in perspective, for over 50 years, these essential nodes of the industrial grid, composed of electrical, steel, and copper windings, were delivered in less than 6 months. This 30-month gap is the first entry in our industrial autopsy. It represents a loss of internal elasticity. When the primary hardware of a civilization can no longer be replaced within a standard business cycle, the industrial base is moving into what historians call a maintenance phase. It's a period where the machine is still running, but the parts to keep it running are becoming increasingly difficult to source. Essentially, we are watching a system begin to cannibalize its own past. Think of it like an old house. For years, you just flip a switch and the lights come on. You don't think about the wiring behind the walls until it fails. When it does, and you find out the parts you need haven't been made in 20 years, the reality of your situation changes. You move from being an owner to being a scavenger. Historically, this pattern has played out before. In the late stages of the Roman Empire, the logistical arteries began to harden. Rome had moved its primary production, its grain and its ore, to the edges of the map. As long as the roads were safe and the energy, in their case, labor and grain, was cheap, the system worked. But when the cost of maintaining those roads exceeded the tax revenue they generated, the empire began a strategic retreat. We see the early markers of a similar retreat today in our global shipping routes. The cost of securing a maritime choke point is beginning to rival the value of the cargo itself. Historically, when sea trade becomes too expensive or too risky, civilizations pivot back to land. We are seeing the early signs of this shift now, as industrial centers of gravity move toward regions where pipelines and rail lines offer a more secure, if less flexible, alternative to the open ocean. But there is a deeper physical limit at play here: thermal inertia. To forge the steel for those transformers, you need constant, high-temperature energy. An electric arc furnace needs a steady, massive surge of power. Many current energy policies, particularly in Europe and the American Midwest, are shifting toward intermittent sources that struggle to provide this constant base load without a backbone of nuclear or traditional power. When a foundry closes because the power grid has become too unstable to support it, that capability doesn't just pause, it evaporates. You can't 3D print a high-grade steel beam with the leftovers of a grid that can't maintain its frequency. This creates a split in the world. On one side, you have jurisdictions that maintain the physical stack, the ability to refine, forge, and build. On the other side, you have regions that are transitioning into a service layer. They manage the digital claims and the administrative paperwork for products they no longer understand how to manufacture. Historians of the British industrial decline noted this exact transition. As the factories moved, the technical literacy of the people went with them. Once the chain of apprenticeship is broken, rebuilding that infrastructure isn't just a matter of writing a check. It's a matter of decades of lost knowledge. The data from 2025 suggests we are reaching a point where the digital map and the physical territory are no longer the same thing. The spreadsheets might show growth, but the lead times tell the truth. The machine is slowing down. If the first sign of an industrial retreat is the lengthening of lead times, the second sign is found in the secondary market. This is the world of repair, refurbishment, and the recovery of old parts. In a healthy industrial cycle, a machine is an asset with a predictable lifespan and a clear path for maintenance. But as we move deeper into 2025, we are seeing the emergence of what might be called digital tenancy. Think back to the mid-20th century. If a farmer bought a tractor or a machinist bought a lathe, they owned the physical reality of that machine. If it broke, they fixed it. They had the manuals. The parts were standardized, and the right to repair was an unspoken law of the land. Ownership was absolute. Today, the forensic data shows a policy trajectory moving in the opposite direction. Modern industrial equipment is increasingly designed with integrated software locks and proprietary components. Whether it is a high-tech harvester or a precision CNC mill, the hardware is now secondary to the software. You pay for the steel and the hydraulics, but you rent the permission to operate them from a central server. Historically, the independence of the merchant and the producer was rooted in the ownership of their tools. When that ownership becomes conditional, dependent on a digital handshake or a subscription fee, the nature of industry changes. It moves from a system of independent producers to a system of managed tenants. This creates a hidden fragility in our infrastructure. We are trading robust analog reliability for thin digital efficiency. Take the power grid as a case study. Much of the hardware currently stabilizing the electrical pulse of our cities, the switch gears and the massive circuit breakers, was manufactured in an era before these digital locks existed. This is legacy hardware. It's old, it's heavy, and it's remarkably resilient. It doesn't need an internet connection to function. But as these legacy systems fail, they are being replaced by smart hardware. These new devices offer incredible data analytics, but they also introduce a new point of failure: the data layer. If the software glitches, or if the manufacturer stops supporting the firmware, the physical hardware can become a brick. We are seeing the early signs of this in some jurisdictions, where equipment is being retired not because the steel failed, but because the software became obsolete. This brings us to a phenomenon we can call strategic neglect. In the late stages of any major infrastructure cycle, the cost of maintenance eventually begins to outpace the revenue generated by the system. This is where logistical triage begins. The authorities start making decisions about which parts of the grid or the road network are essential and which can be allowed to fade. You might see this in your own town. The bridge that has been under temporary load restrictions for 5 years, or the water main that breaks every winter because it's 40 years past its engineered lifespan. This isn't just bad luck, it's a reflection of a system that is prioritizing the digital core over the physical periphery. For the person living on that periphery, the realization is sobering. You can no longer assume that the centralized utility will always be there to fix the problem. This is why we are seeing a quiet resurgence in analog technical literacy. People are beginning to value tools that are dumb but durable. A 1950s-era Bridgeport mill that can be repaired with a wrench is starting to look a lot more like a sovereign asset than a 2024 model that requires a factory technician and a satellite link. We are moving into a period where the ability to maintain your own world is the only real hedge against systemic decay. The industrial autopsy isn't a prediction of a total shutdown. It's a description of a system that is becoming more complex, more expensive, and less reliable all at the same time. To understand why this industrial retreat is happening, we have to look at the mercantilist shift. For decades, the global economy operated on the assumption of a flat world, a neutral marketplace where raw materials flowed predictably to whoever had the most currency. But the forensic data of 2025 shows the world is becoming curved. Historically, resources are not just commodities, they are the physical basis of sovereignty. We are seeing a return to a reality where nations that possess primary materials are no longer content to export raw ore in exchange for digital fiat. They are demanding that the value add, the factories and the refineries remain within their own borders. Think of it like the refinery gap. It's a common mistake to think that mining is the primary bottleneck of the modern world. In reality, the seat of power is refining. You can have all the lithium or copper in the world, but if you don't have the high-heat chemical plants to turn that ore into industrial-grade material, you effectively have nothing. The West has spent 30 years offshoring these dirty industries, believing it was shedding low-value work. But as the maintenance phase of our civilization sets in, we are realizing that we didn't just offshore the pollution, we offshored our primary sovereignty. If a trade bloc controls the high-purity neon required for lasers or the specialized resins for aerospace, they hold a veto power over the industrial output of their rivals. It's not a conspiracy. It's just the logistical reality of the chemical stack. This leads us to the myth of the service economy. In the 1990s and 2000s, the transition from manufacturing to services was marketed as a sign of civilizational maturity. But from a historical perspective, a service economy is a derivative economy. It's a layer of complexity that can only exist as long as the primary industrial engine is producing a physical surplus. You can't service a bridge that hasn't been built, and you can't finance a factory that has no reliable power. We are seeing the service bubble begin to leak air as the underlying physical reality reasserts its dominance. Historically, when an empire loses its ability to transform its own raw materials, its currency becomes a digital claim on products it can no longer control. We see this in the 2025 data as a bifurcated labor market. We have a surplus of administrative and digital workers, but a terminal shortage of the people who can actually manipulate matter: the pipe fitters, the welders, and the industrial chemists. The result is a strange kind of information poverty. We have more data than any humans in history, yet we have less capability to fix a broken water main or stabilize a failing transformer than our grandfathers did. In a forensic sense, we are wealthy on paper, but poor in terms of physical agency. This isn't just an economic shift, it's a psychological one. We've been trained to believe that the virtual is more important than the physical. But as the lead times grow and the legacy hardware fails, the world is being forced to remember a very old lesson. The person who owns the tools and the energy to run them is the only one who is truly sovereign. The industrial autopsy shows us that the globalized, centralized model isn't just breaking, it's recentering. It's moving away from the individual and toward the institutions that still control the physical stack. The only way out of that enclosure is to start building a physical buffer of your own. To understand the competence crisis, we have to look at how a civilization actually stores its intelligence. We tend to think knowledge is stored in libraries or on servers, but industrial intelligence is actually stored in muscle memory. It is a form of tacit knowledge passed from a master to an apprentice over decades of physical trial and error. In the late stages of any industrial cycle, there is a risk of what historians call a knowledge break. This happens when a society stops valuing the maker and starts prioritizing the manager. In 2025, we are reaching a demographic cliff. The median age of a master machinist or a specialized electrical engineer in the West is now often in the late 50s. As this master class retires, they aren't just taking their pensions, they are taking the unwritten rules of the infrastructure with them. Think of a specialized chemical refinery. You can have the blueprints for the entire facility, but the blueprints don't tell you how a specific valve behaves when the temperature drops 10 degrees, or how to feel a vibration in a turbine that signals a failure 3 days before the sensors detect it. That intuition is the hidden glue of the industrial world. When the chain of apprenticeship is broken, you can't just re-skill a population of digital administrators with a 6-month boot camp. It takes 20 years to build a master tool and die maker. The 2025 data suggests we are entering a competence gap where we still have the machines, but we are losing the literacy required to maintain them. This is the catalyst for the shadow foundry. In the historical records of the late 14th century, after the labor shortages of the Black Death, we saw the rise of localized guilds. These were small, decentralized groups that owned their own tools and their own secrets. They operated independently of the central authorities because the authorities couldn't survive without them. We are seeing the early signs of a neo-guild movement today. This is the rise of the sovereign producer, the person who is quietly decoupling from the globalized, digitally locked system. These are small-scale workshops using legacy hardware like 1950s lathes or manual milling machines. Why legacy hardware? Because a manual lathe doesn't require a software update to turn a piece of steel. It doesn't need a diagnostic handshake with a server in another country to function. It is dumb, but it is sovereign. This is the subterranean industrial revolution. It's not about hobbyists making plastic toys. It's about technicians reclaiming the ability to maintain the essentials: water pumps, power generators, and agricultural tools. They are building a physical buffer against a system that is becoming too complex and too fragile to rely on. Historically, when the center can no longer provide reliability, the periphery must provide for itself. The industrial autopsy shows that we are moving toward a tiered society. Those who are dependent on a flickering, managed grid, and those who have the tools and the competence to maintain their own reality. It's a return to the oldest form of wealth, the ability to pick up a tool and move matter. In a world of digital abstractions, the person who can fix a broken world is the only one who truly owns their future. To complete this autopsy, we have to look at how the individual survives the maintenance phase of an empire. Historically, when the centralized distribution networks for tools and materials begin to fray, wealth is redefined. It moves away from currency and back toward inventory. This is the concept of the sovereign stockpile. In the late 20th century, the industrial world became obsessed with just-in-time logistics. The idea was that carrying inventory was a waste of capital. Why hold a ton of steel or a crate of bearings when you can order them on a screen and have them delivered tomorrow? On paper, this was highly efficient. But from a forensic standpoint, it was a total liquidation of resilience. Historically, the people who navigated periods of industrial retreat were those who understood commodity baskets. The blacksmith with a year's supply of coal, or the farmer with a deep store of seed, didn't care about the fluctuations of the imperial currency. They held master materials, the physical foundations of life. In 2025, the sovereign producer is returning to this logic. They aren't prepping for a cinematic collapse. They are insuring against a logistical slowdown. This means building a stockpile of materials that do not rot, do not rust easily, and cannot be deleted by a bank bail-in. We're talking about copper wire, high-purity lubricants, standardized fasteners, and raw tool steel. These are the hard tokens of the real economy. In a world where lead times for a transformer have tripled and the refinery gap is widening, these materials become more stable than any bond or stock. They are the seed corn of the next industrial era. This leads us to the verdict of the autopsy. The data suggests that the centralized, globalized industrial machine is not going to restart its growth phase. It is reaching its thermodynamic and logistical limits. But as a historian of finance, I see this not as the end of production, but as the end of the consumer. For 80 years, we have been a civilization of users. We've been passengers on a very fast, very efficient train. The industrial autopsy shows that the train is slowing down and the tracks ahead are no longer being maintained. You have two choices. You can stay in your seat and wait for the managed decline to reach your station, or you can step off the train and start building your own means of transit. The sovereign frontier is not a place, it's a state of being. It's the decision to reclaim your maintenance rights. It's the choice to prioritize analog reliability over digital convenience. As we look at the ruins of the old industrial model, we see that the only things that truly survived previous resets were the things that people could fix themselves. The tools that required a master to operate, but didn't require an empire to sustain. Your final forensic checklist is simple. Audit your dependencies. If your ability to provide value depends on a digital handshake from a company that might not exist in 10 years, you are in a fragile position. If your ability to provide value depends on your own tools, your own materials, and your own muscle memory, you are sovereign. The machine is slowing down. The lights in the shopping mall are flickering. But for the person who knows how to pick up a tool and move matter, the work is just beginning. The autopsy is finished. The reality of the new frontier is here. It's time to head back to the workshop. If we look back at the long depression of the late 19th century or the post-war industrial shifts of the 1940s, we see a recurring pattern in how technical capital is preserved. It isn't preserved by the large institutions. It is preserved by the generalist. In a period of industrial expansion, the world rewards the specialist, the person who knows everything about a very narrow, hyper-complex slice of a supply chain. But in the maintenance phase, the specialist becomes a liability. If you only know how to program a specific robotic arm that no longer has replacement parts, your utility vanishes. The forensic historian notes that during a contraction, the generalist becomes the anchor of the community. This is the first of our master skills, the literacy of systems. A sovereign producer doesn't just know how to use a tool. They understand the power train. They know how energy is converted from a fuel source into mechanical motion and then into a finished product. This is why we see a resurgence in interest in external combustion engines like the Stirling or basic steam plants. These are technologies that are fuel agnostic. They don't care if the global supply of high-purity diesel is interrupted. They can run on whatever thermal energy is available. Historically, the ability to generate mechanical work without a centralized grid was the defining line between a town that thrived and a town that collapsed. This is the inertia of the small scale. By mastering the physics of simple machines, levers, gears, and basic hydraulics, the individual reclaims the power that the centralized machine has monopolized for a century. The second master skill is material identification. In a world of industrial scavenging, you have to know what you are looking at. You have to be able to tell the difference between high-carbon tool steel and mild structural steel just by the spark pattern on a grinder. You have to know which legacy hardware contains the high-purity copper or the hardened bearings that are no longer being manufactured. This is the archaeology of the present. Every junkyard and abandoned factory becomes a resource vein for the person with the literacy to mine it. Historically, the reuse economy has always been more robust than the consumer economy during a reset. In 2025, the data suggests that the most successful producers are those who are building their physical buffer from the high-quality materials of the past. Finally, we have to discuss the logistics of trust. In the old industrial model, trust was institutional. You trusted the brand, the certification, and the global standard. In the sovereign frontier, trust is local. It's based on the handshake and the work. As the digital enclosure makes commerce more taxed, and restricted, the sovereign producer moves toward a peer-to-peer economy. This is the return of the vocational aristocracy, a class of people whose status is based not on their bank balance, but on their reputation for solving physical problems. When the just-in-time system fails, the person who can fix the neighborhood's water pump or keep the local bakery's ovens running becomes the most important person in the room. The industrial autopsy is not just a study of death. It is a blueprint for a different kind of life. It's a realization that the centralized machine was always a temporary luxury provided by an era of easy energy. That era is closing, but the laws of physics, the properties of matter, and the ingenuity of the human hand are permanent. The machine is slowing down, but the workshop is just getting started. The autopsy is complete. The verdict is yours. It's time to stop being a user of the old world and start being a builder of the new one.